Sure, we can have fire. And we can have the knowledge of fire. But with that comes the knowledge of everything. We become like a god. Because to be all-powerful is to be all-suffering. Yes. Thus, Prometheus gave us light and warmth and eternal damnation and the awareness of our isolation for everything holy. Quite the conundrum, fire. It's enough to make a man drink.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everybody's doing well. Today we're going to be talking about Gwyn. Mainly because I want to clear up some misconceptions, some that I am in part responsible for because I didn't go back and double check the lore of Dark Souls 1 when I made the audio video, and sort of it's been spitballing ever since. My biggest mistake was that I thought I had the lore of Dark Souls 1 on shorthand, but that lore that I had in my mind was sort of incorrect, or not all the way correct. And that sort of led to multiple assumptions and conclusions being drawn that were all based off of a misconception, and I'm sure you guys have noticed this or maybe pointed it out in the comments, but I've also just noticed that a lot of people sort of just have the wrong idea about Gwyn. I mean, maybe they have some right ideas about him, but I don't know, I feel this need to attempt to characterize him and frame all of his actions and just sort of present them to you in this video as a way of saying that, yeah, maybe Gwyn wasn't the best guy, but he wasn't the evil overlord that I was depicting him as in the audio video, and he probably isn't even half as bad as Marika from Elden Ring. Of course, those are all, subjective conclusions. The whole point of the video isn't to make someone feel a certain way or another about Gwyn, it's just to present the actual facts, because I've attributed various things to him that he wasn't even around to have done. It's probably why I have this burning need to make this video and sort of correct previous mistakes. It's just a habit. So now that we've got that long ass preamble out of the way, let's get right into it. The legend of Gwyn, or Gwyn and the Grand Lie. So Gwyn comes from the Age of Ancients, which was when there were arch trees everywhere and everlasting dragons with stone scales ruled the skies, and the various humanoid tribes lived underground. Now, at some point or another, 4 lucky individuals discovered fire, and in the fire they found 4 powerful souls. Now, part of me always wondered what Gwyn's whole relationship with Frampt was when he met him, and I sort of think that at some point perhaps the primordial serpents, maybe Frampt or maybe even Koth, is what led these humanoids to the fire. That is, of course, just speculation. They very well could have come across the fire on their own, but the idea of a eldritch serpent tempting mankind, or a version of mankind with unheard of power beyond their wildest dreams, isn't really unheard of. But again, there's no real basis for it in the game. We just know that at some point, Gwyn befriended Frampt. Probably something we'll explore more in my Serpents video. But anyway, moving on. The newfound power of their 4 souls, each of these individuals sort of built their own little societies and, in some cases, armies. Gwyn in particular amassed quite a horde of followers, and he armored them up, gave them swords, and turned them into his Silver Knight army. Using the immense power of his soul, he had somehow discovered how to weaponize light itself by weaving it into spears of lightning and hurling them through the air. This would turn out to be highly effective on the scales of dragons, which were largely thought to be unbreakable and everlasting, but not when it came to lightning. Now, Gwyn would teach these miracles to his followers, as well as his firstborn son, who we know was a veteran in his wars, so he was at least around at this point. His name, of course, was lost, but he was known as a god of war, as well as the patron saint of the Sunlight Warriors Covenant. Gwyn had some other kids too, but we'll get to them when the story calls for it. But for now, Gwyn allied himself with the other powerful Lord Soul holders, the Witch of Izalith and her daughters, the Witches of Chaos, as well as the first of the dead, Nito. Gwyn was thorough when it came to his allies. I mean, the guy even managed to enlist the things he feared most, the inheritors of the Dark Soul, into fighting by his side against the everlasting dragons, and with all of his allies assembled, soon enough, a good old-fashioned genocide would unfold. So we've all seen the opening cinematic of Dark Souls 1, Gwyn and his horde of lightning chuckers pelting the dragons with bolts that broke through their allegedly unbreakable scales. I mean, shit, the dragons must have been shitting bricks when they saw the first one of their own go down, but it didn't stop there. That was just the tip of the spear. The witches of Izalith weaved great firestorms and let him loose. Nero unleashed his miasma of death on them and their archtrees, and the early humans brutalized and beheaded the dragons and then made them into shields that shoot fire. And the giants also helped out, but what finally turned the tide against the dragons was one of their own turning against them, a great betrayal. Much like the hunchback dude from 300, Seath the Scaleless was a deformed creature, in this case a dragon instead of a Spartan, but you get what I mean. He was detested by the other dragons, so it probably wasn't very hard for Gwyn and the others to turn him against his own kind. And when he did finally turn against the dragons, it was pretty much a wrap. The war was over and the Alliance won. In the end, most of the everlasting dragons were no more. They were very nearly completely exterminated, although obviously a few did slip through the cracks, like Midir, who was a child of the archdragons, was likely born after the genocide or was too young to have participated in the war that led to the genocide. He's often described as having been raised by the gods, so he was sort of like a trophy after the battle. There was that one surviving dragon that managed to find his way to the remaining arch trees and set up an area to build a covenant. For my money, it's one of the most atmospheric zones in all of Dark Souls, but there's not really all that much to do here except stand in awe of how cool it is and listen to the music. And of course, who could forget the fabled black dragon Calamite? I mean, the gods of Londo sure couldn't. Try as they might, they just couldn't take the black dragon out. He was their calamity, it was right in his name, Calamite, it reminds me of the Italian word calamita, which I think means, surprise, surprise, calamity. But he got turned into a ring, I believe, and the ring can still be found by the days of Dark Souls 3, so that's pretty cool. And based on the not-so-clear timeline, it appears Calamite was at large until roughly 8 or so hundred years after Gwyn burned himself. So yeah, he definitely was around a lot longer than the other dragons. Or maybe it was another Midir situation where he was young during the Dragon Wars and he grew up to adulthood in the aftermath. Plus, Oolacile's placement in the whole timeline, it sort of gets, it's not really that clear. We just have the developer comment, and it wasn't even Miyazaki who said, I believe, that it took about 200 years or 300 years before the start of the game, which I would assume to mean roughly 800 or 700 years after Gwyn tossed himself into the fire. Plus, we have to take into account that the undead burg doesn't appear to have been built yet, same with the parish, as well as most of Sen's. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while since I've done a whole deep dive in the area. But as far as I can tell, all things considered, Calamite wasn't slain until, very recently in the timeline of Dark Souls 1. And very recently here meaning roughly 200 or 300 years before the start of the game. This may be getting into rambling territory. But anyway, the dragons were gone, and Gwyn awards Seath with a piece of his own lord's soul for his betrayal of the everlasting dragons and assistance to Gwyn's cause. It was also said that Seath was embraced by Gwyn's family, and some speculate that he fathered a bastard with Gwyn's daughter Guinevere. Whatever the actual circumstances were, Seath would return the favor by experimenting on Guinevere's handmaidens and turning them into crying squids. Now, Gwyn's reward for the humans, or rather pygmy assistance in the Dragon Wars was a little more complicated. He saw firsthand what they were capable of. They were knocking off dragons right alongside his dragon slayers and his giants. Their soul didn't lose strength as it was divided out to the original pygmies' descendants and their descendants. As you could probably guess, this meant that it would basically just keep growing in power as time passed, more and more so as the fire faded. This was a byproduct of that disparity that was born from fire, light and dark, one of the many things that was born from that. Gwyn wanted to solve this problem before it got out of hand without bloodshed, especially after they had all just fought a war together. So he decided he would give the pygmies a massive, beautiful city, one that was on the same level as Londo, his very own Disneyland, but it would be located at the end of the world. And he would also send Seath's daughter down there along with the last archdragon who had been raised to effectively hold off the spread of the abyss by eating it. And he would send them down as a sort of insurance, that the spread of the Dark Soul was contained. The city itself was displaced time-wise, and don't you just love vague descriptions like that? But it really only amounts to just being a fancy way of saying it's very hard to get to, and under normal circumstances it's probably inaccessible, seeing as how we only get here via the kiln, but others had made it there, so there are other ways into the city. But anyway, that wasn't all. Gwyn would also give the pygmies Filianor, one of his daughters, as a show of good faith, as befit their new status as his vassals. But tricky Gwyn here would brand them. Actually, he would brand their very soul. The dark soul itself, which was shared amongst all of the pygmies and their descendants, as well as the humans, their further down the line descendants, and all of them were now marked, and as a result, that brand was shared across all of humanity as the dark sign. The dark sign was something that would begin to appear as the flame began to fade. It was widely viewed as the cause of the undead curse, which isn't really a curse at all. It's simply the power of the fire fading and revealing the human forms, that they're an illusion provided by the flame and Gwyn's magic, his light and his use of the first flame and all that. The dark sign appearing is just a sign that the fire that provided Gwyn the magic that he used to brand all of humanity, that is fading and its overall power is waning, thus revealing evidence of Gwyn's deception. Not that it mattered though, they'd find a way to spin that, but we'll get to that. This whole thing was kind of what Aldea was so worked up about in Dark Souls 2. The flame made man take on a fleeting form, and as nice as an illusion as that is, it's still a lie, and as Aldea puts it, a lie will remain a lie. Getting a little off topic here, but I think it's all in the spirit of things. So, long story short, the pygmies were branded, tricked into being vassals to Gwyn, and then shipped off to their gilded cage with a baby archdragon that had orders to eat the abyss. And the abyss was sort of like a byproduct of the pygmies' dark soul, it had a corruptive nature. Midir probably also acted as a form of insurance that kept the pygmies confined within their city. That poor dragon probably had to spend nearly his entire unending lifespan doing this shit work that Gwyn assigned him for. I mean, honestly, Gwyn also gave up his youngest daughter as well to the pygmies for them to worship, leaving her with the honeyed lie of one day returning for her, something he knew was a lie when he said it. This whole thing is commemorated by a statue in the ringed city of Gwyn placing a crown similar to his own but noticeably smaller on the head of what appears to be a kneeling, crouching hollow, while also presenting him with the Chloranthy Ring 3. The smaller crown represents the pygmies accepting the position as vassals to Gwyn's clan, and the ring presumably represents Filianor. And when you think about it, from the pygmies' perspective, this was a win-win. I mean, they got a god, a city, a dragon, and a sweet crown from Gwyn. As far as they were concerned, they got the respect that they had earned. It was a worthy reward for their contributions, and the negative side of it all didn't really affect them directly if they even knew about it at all. All they had to do was accept a brand, which they might have viewed as customary for swearing allegiance to a higher power, in this case, Gwyn. Regardless of the nuance in the pygmies' decision to accept the brand, or if the brand was placed secretly, the pygmies swearing allegiance to Gwyn would not really affect them directly negatively at all. It would be their descendants, the humans, that would ultimately suffer the weight of their decision to kneel to Gwyn. But I guess that's history for you. That's neither here nor there. So Gwyn thought his problem was solved for now and went back to doing his usual god shit. His Age of Fire was a big deal because it was totally unprecedented. It was completely different to what came before. In the Age of Ancients, everyone looked like hollows or Thumerians, and they lived underground beneath the arch trees and tunnels while fire-breathing stone dragons ruled the skies and presumably burned them if they poked their heads out. Then you look at the height of the Age of Fire, and there's multiple thriving kingdoms and nations. There's developments in magic and miracles and medicine and science. By science, I mean like alchemy and making consumables, but you get what I mean. The Age of Fire had so many possibilities for Gwyn's clan and the other clans, as well as the humans, so I think it's safe to say that all of the parties involved, minus the dragons, probably preferred the Age of Fire to what came before. And also, it was the natural course of events. The Age of Ancients couldn't last forever, just as this new Age of Fire surely wouldn't. Although time would tell if this was something that Gwyn would ever come to understand or accept. Anyway, though, Gwyn had a number of children, but again, there's no mention of a wife. Some have speculated that it could have been Velka, and I think that is reasonable, but there's very little info on it. Plus, there's all this cut stuff with Velka where it becomes kind of like one of those things where should we factor in cut content all the time? Or, I mean, sometimes they repurpose it and completely change it, so, it's a whole thing. Just for the sake of simplicity, we'll list Gwyn's wife as unknown. Now, I'm not saying he's acting like Jupiter and creating his kids all on his own. there probably was a woman involved. We just have like no information on her. But yeah, back to his kids. So anyway, besides the nameless king, who is largely believed to be the missing firstborn son of Gwyn, he famously had the daughter Guinevere, who was known as a goddess of beauty and fertility. He also had a second son who was born more attuned to the moon, which was a fancy way of saying he was sort of a sissy. So he was, in Gwyn's own words, quote, raised as a woman, and I'm of course referring to Gwendolyn, the future leader of the Dark Moon Blades Covenant, and future chief god of Anor Londo. Now, he famously has serpents for a lower half, so something's definitely off with him, but he stepped up to the plate to run things in Anor Londo eventually when the time came, so you gotta commend him for that, although he wasn't that great of a dude, really. Still, I'm not entirely convinced that he deserved the ultimate fate he got, but again, look at me getting off subject. Plus, all that is ways off. Now, Gwyn's final child is known as Filianor, who we mentioned earlier was given over to the Pygmies in their ringed city to be worshipped and to essentially seal the deal with the Pygmies staying in their city at the end of the world and doing what Gwyn wanted. And as we already talked about, he left her with a deliciously honeyed lie, the type of thing you'd expect a noble, godly father to say if he's halfway decent, but Gwyn knew he'd never fulfill this promise, and that he probably had no desire to ever set foot in the Ring City again. Anyway, things were going good for Gwyn. I mean, shit, this must have been the Age of Plenty section of his Age of Fire. Everything was working out in his favor. When the descendants of the Pygmies, the humans, began settling in the lands beneath Anor Londo, building their own city, New Londo as it was called, it eventually grew into this massive nation, or rather it was a big city-state with its own unique identity, culture, and society, to the point where it supposedly rivaled the City of the Gods in its heyday, but its inhabitants, well, they were still subservient to Gwyn and his clan, and they worshipped them like the alleged living gods that they were. Impressed with both their works and allegiance, the good Lord of Light decided to break off a piece of his own soul for the city's 4 magistrates because of the example that they had set for humanity. I mean, shit, they built a thriving human colony that had revered Gwyn and his ilk. That was something to be rewarded. Plus, you can't help but think that Gwyn thought of the New Londo humans as, quote, the good ones, considering the huge gift that he gave them. But, well, we all know how that turned out for them in the end, don't we? More on that subject later, probably. So, moving on, at some point the Chaos Witch, one of Gwyn's allies, tried to create another First Flame, and it resulted in the creation of the Chaos Flame. Now, the Chaos Flame was crazy, unpredictable, and wild, and it would turn the witch into a rooty demon seedbed that we know as the worst boss in the series, the Bed of Chaos. This monstrosity produced all of the demons we know and love from the Dark Souls series. Well, not the ones in Dark Souls 2, but that's a whole other story. Her fuck-up was so profound, so large-scale, that it's still being felt in both of the sequels in some way. Her children were also all turned into monsters, well, except for 2 of them, Quilana and the hostile one in Islith. Gwyn's response was to send his Silver Knights in with specialized, oversized weapons that were more effective at icing these big-ass monstrous demons. This burned the Knights' armor black in the process, and they can still be found hunting demons to this very day. I mean, that's why they're in the Parish and the Burg, and in the Demon Ruins. Timeline gets a little confusing. At least I believe it was Gwyn who sent the Knights to go deal with the Chaos Demons. It might have happened after he already burned himself, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to assume that this happened before. Anyway, back to the main event. After a certain point, Gwyn realizes the fire is fading, and he wasn't ready for the night to end. He wanted the party to go on forever. He feared the dark mainly because he had now known light, and he loved it. The warmth, the endless gift its power had provided him. His Age of Fire was sort of a monument to his victory against impossible odds, and it was all he knew at this point. He definitely couldn't go back to living underground. He wanted this party to last forever, and who could blame him? He was on top of the world. His Age of Fire was arguably a much better time than the Age of Ancients, at least for humans and humanoids. Ultimately, he couldn't bear to live in a world where the cycles took their natural course if it meant that he couldn't control what came next. That's why he gave the Pygmies the dark sign. He saw the potential of their power. He knew that one day the lights would go out and his strength would be non-existent. What use is a Lord of Light in a world of darkness? This supposed natural course of life was to him more like planned obsolescence for both himself and his Age of Fire. Some would argue that you can't blame him for wanting to go against it. I would argue that you can, but it didn't really matter what came next to Gwyn if it meant the end of all he had built. He was there at the end of the previous age. The dragons were all killed and the arch trees were burned. That ended up being the natural course, so it's not surprising that he might think that at the end of his age of fire that his bones or bloody carcass would serve as the foundation for whatever would come next, just as the dragons and the arch trees had been for the societies of Gwyn and his company. He also feared the unknown. Whatever came next would have been quite different than his age if he couldn't find any ways to prolong it. It's possible that he was afraid of the dark not necessarily because he didn't understand it, but because he knew that it required his death, this new age. His bones were going to be the foundation, the building blocks, his soul as well, if you will. He had every reason to believe that a Dark Lord of humans would rise and usher in a new age, so he acted first. When he felt his power waning and the fires fading, he made a final decision. This is why he burned himself for a millennia, not just to prolong his works and creations or his victories. He wanted it to last so that it would all have been worth it. He was so attached to what he built that when the fires were all but faded, he cast himself into it to give his age of fire a second wind. And it worked. He proved to be worthy kindling, and his knights followed him in and were burnt black. They still exist in the kiln guarding their hollified lord, and some of them still wander around Lordran, still burnt. Also, if you're wondering why Gwyn was all hollowed out there in the kiln, well, I think it's because he gave it all to the flame, quite literally, everything that made him special, but it was mostly just his soul and his body. And now what we're seeing in the kiln is the burnt out husk of, what was left of Gwyn after he was all but burned away, after everything that made him special from his Lord soul was burned away. It's almost as if throwing himself into the flame to use his soul as kindling had reverted him to his original form, but with visible tatters of the identity that he'd built for himself with the power of his Lord soul. His skill with the sword is something that he retains, as well as his miracle use. I imagine it's all just muscle memory, but he's still quite deadly, and it's just an extreme fall from grace from what he once was. This soulless husk of a man was once a god of light, and he does sort of look the part. He looks like crack Zeus. Anyway, so now we move into the aftermath of Gwyn's burning. So I'm not sure if Gwyn left clear instructions for the rest of his clan when he dove into the kiln, or if they just had to come up with it as they went. Perhaps something was lost in the translation, or I missed a description, but I couldn't really figure that one out. So a lot of these things I'll be attributing to the Way of White and various members, as it appears they occurred after Gwyn burned himself. So the Way of White shifted its leadership to Allfather Lloyd, who proclaimed himself Gwyn's uncle and chief god of the Pantheon in Gwyn's absence. He created the famous undead hunts, sent hollows to the asylums, or dumped them in the painted world, those type of things. He may have been the one to banish Gwyn's firstborn for, quote, foolishness, and his godhood was revoked. I like to think that the nameless king or the firstborn said fuck no in regards to him being next to link the flame when it faded, but it more than likely just had something to do with dragons. Who knows if the firstborn was even capable of linking the flame? I mean, he might have tried it and just burned to ashes, which is probably why he could have said fuck that. You can't blame him for opting out if that was the reason. Anyway, the nameless firstborn would leave a miracle on Gwyn's ceremonial grave before heading up to Archdragon Peak to, quote, fly like an eagle. Now, we don't know exactly when he left because there's that destroyed statue in the parish, which doesn't seem to have been built until after Gwyn burned and Oolacile fell, but I suppose it could have been built by the Sunlight Warriors who were loyal to him and then later destroyed when the Way of White caught wind of it. Allfather Lloyd ran the Way of White unchecked for some time until Gwendolyn, Gwyn's second son, came out of hiding and deposed him to take over as chief god. Gwyn's daughter Guinevere would depart at some point with her husband Flan and have several heavenly children. Some believe that they founded the Kingdom of Hyde in Dark Souls 2 due to its obvious similarities to the architecture of Anor Londo. Its Hyde Knights also look vaguely similar to the Sunlight Warriors, and it's even got statues of Gwyn, although they've got bird heads instead of the whole Alan Moore look that he previously rocked, but I'm getting off track. More on the Children of Gwyn in a more dedicated video. Anyway, I don't want this to be too rambly, but let's cover a few more events that happened presumably after Gwyn set off into the kiln. Mainly stuff like the fall of Oolacile, the fall of New Londo and its subsequent flooding, and the creation of a myth, a grand lie of a prophecy about a chosen undead who would succeed Gwyn and continue the Age of Fire. But let's start with New Londo. So the four kings that Gwyn had given a piece of his very soul to, as well as their grand city, was corrupted by the abyss, and they even managed to open a literal portal to the darkness. See, the four kings had been tempted by the serpent Koth, who taught them and their knights the art of life drain, and thus the knights of New Londo became the very first dark wraiths. The gods sent Gwyn's resident abyss expert Artorias down to New Londo to deal with the problem, but no matter how many corpses of dark wraiths he and his dog piled up, he just couldn't make it through the abyss to reach the four kings. Even with all of his special talismans and making a literal covenant with the beasts of the abyss, he just couldn't reach these four super wraiths. So Anor Londo sent down 3 sealers to flood the city of New Londo in a last-ditch effort to contain this heinous spread of the abyss, and it was seemingly successful. The four kings and the dark wraiths were all still trapped down there, and the residents who were all killed turned into ghosts. The corruption of the abyss mixed with the flooding seems to have created some undead conglomerates who are basically just hollow-faced, muck-looking creatures that you'll find down there. Perhaps Gwyn did have a reason to fear the darkness, but on the other hand of that, maybe his meddling and branding of the Dark Soul is what led to the abyss being this corruptive, mutating force. It was something that was being denied its natural course of events. I know I probably said that sentence enough times, so let's move on to the fall of Oolacile. Okay, so according to, not really developer comments, more producer comments, but according to one of the game's producers, Daisuke Uchiyama, the fall of Oolacile happened roughly 200 to 300 years in the past, presumably from the start of the game. And I could be wrong, but I believe that's like 700 or 800 years after Gwyn torched himself, which it's not an exact date, but it's always been believed that he burned himself roughly 1,000 years before the start of the game, or at least that's what I had believed. If you look around Oolacile and the Royal Wood, it doesn't appear that the undead burg or parish has been built yet, and as far as I can tell, Sens appears to still be under construction. So I'm pretty sure Gwyn was already long gone when Oolacile fell, unless I missed something or misinterpreted something. So in previous videos when I said that Gwyn sent Goff and Artorias down here, that was wrong, and it was actually more than likely Gwendolyn that sent them, as Gwyn was already gone. But both this event and New Londo's fall put the fear of the abyss into the world. Oolacile's residents got turned into pinecone-headed monsters and sorcerers, and New Londo, well, it had to be forcibly quarantined, and its residents became ghosts and horrifying conglomerates of muck. The city sort of became a cautionary tale that served as a proof of concept that the abyss and humanity were bad. You know, all the more reason to persecute the undead. But long story short, both of these events were viewed as a sign of what was to come if the fire wasn't linked. Although a lot of Oolacile's true history got covered up by fairy tale legends and stories courtesy of a certain mushroom, but there are surviving records of the truth of what happened in Oolacile. When it comes down to it, who are you going to trust more, a talking mushroom who can't move or a Cheshire cat? Plus, I mean, we all know the truth of what happened. But anyway, this brings us to the final section. The creation of the chosen undead myth, the grand lie to succeed Gwyn and prolong the Age of Fire using the power of the Dark Soul. This was likely done by Gwendolyn and the rest of the Way of White as a way to, quote, keep the lights on, using undead champions as batteries. The Way of White spread the myth as a prophecy that one day a chosen undead would rise up, traverse Lordran, ring the bells, and conquer Sen's fortress before claiming the Lord Vessel, recovering the Lord's souls, and finally laying Gwyn to rest before replacing him as the Flame's new heavenly hookah coal. This prospective undead would be guided by Gwyn's buddy, Frampt the World Serpent, from one bell to the next. All the while, the snake is talking to them as if this particular hollow was actually chosen by the gods, when we know the truth. They just happened to be a particularly capable hollow, but they were of no real import. The prophecy was made up, but that doesn't mean it can't come true. And if it comes true, doesn't that prove its validity? Well, I'm not really sure, and this is not really the place to get into that debate, but you get what I'm trying to say. This would all lead to the construction of the undead burg that would house one of the bells and the parish. This was a human colony in Lordran that was now entirely populated by undead, excluding the occasional Black Knight or Chaos Demon. The nearby undead parish had the statue of the Firstborn that I mentioned earlier, that it kind of makes it seem like he left a lot later on than I had previously thought. Maybe Gwendolyn is as shady as he looks and is the one who actually banished his brother instead of it being Allfather Lloyd, but that's one of those things we'll probably never get a clear answer to, but felt like I had to mention it. The statue could also indicate that the parish predates the burg, but again, this is all just speculation, and if it does predate the burg, then by how much? Anyway, the completion of Sen's Fortress happened prior to the construction of the bells, which was designed to wake up the Link the Fire tutorial serpent Frampt and open up the gates to Sen's. Sen's was yet another proving ground for worthy undead to test if they had what it takes to sustain another Age of Fire. Very few actually made it that far, and that was less than half of the journey, so that just goes to tell you how hard these tests were. Iron Tarkus famously struck down the Iron Golem and reached the City of the Gods, only to die by falling off of a catwalk in the painting room, so your biggest obstacles can occasionally be what you least expect. So the myth of the chosen undead eventually became a famous legend. So kingdoms of men would rise up, and some of them were educated on a national scale to travel to Lordran to link the flame and follow in Gwyn's footsteps, as is the case with King Rendal and his famous Baldernice, which we can see all over the undead burg. Human noble families from faraway lands would send their undead to Lordran with hopes of them linking the fire, or at the very least just getting a few more undead out of their hair, because that was a key problem that human kingdoms had, was the curse of the undead. Gwyn's soul would continue to exert power over the land long after he was defeated in the kiln. His soul would get a second chance at life in the days of Dranlake. He reincarnated into a lesser lord from an unimportant land, who rose up to become a powerful warlord and king with the help of his foreign mentor. This reincarnation's true name is lost to the echoes of time, but he's known to all of us as the Old Iron King. He's got a whole bunch of lore, and I like to view him as sort of a separate character from Gwyn because he's kind of got his own storyline. I do cover him a bit in the Shards of Manus video, and I think the one I did about the Mysterious East. I know in the Vendrick video I gave good old Vendrick some credit for some of the things that the old Iron King did, like the undead hunts in the Purgatory and all that. I corrected it in a later video, but it's something I can't bring up enough. Those things were done by the old Iron King, not Vendrick. But yeah, if you're interested in him, check out some of those other two videos I mentioned. Plus, he'll get the spotlight eventually when I cover all of the great ones or the old ones from Dark Souls 2 in a video. Anyway, moving on. Gwyn himself has a sort of cameo in Dark Souls 3, well, more like his theme and his moveset, as the second phase of the Soul of Cinder boss fight. So it appears to be the Soul of Cinder, the flame itself, calling on Gwyn's skill and power to test this new champion who may be there to link the flame, but they also might be there to usurp it or smother it. Who knows? And shit, if you're there to smother it or usurp it, this is sort of like Gwyn coming back from the grave one last time to try and preserve the Age of Fire. Pretty cool stuff, but I believe that was everything I needed to cover about Gwyn. Again, and as always, if I missed anything, please let me know in the comments. That always means the most to me. And if you liked the video, please consider liking it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on about these various subjects for various lengths of time, please consider subscribing. There's also a Patreon page you can check out, but the main selling point there is ad-free videos. Anyway, let's have some final thoughts, and then we'll have sounds from the Alchemy Lab to close out the video. It's a new thing I'm trying. So yeah, Gwyn definitely made some selfish choices, but he definitely believed what he was doing was right. We're talking about a guy who shaped the very world that these games take place in. The echoes of this dude's actions in life are still being felt even by the third installment of the series.
What we do in this life echoes in eternity!
Also worth noting that Gwyn believing that he's doing the right thing doesn't excuse him of his wrongdoings. Plenty of real-world people did horrific things and justified it by either believing or just simply saying that they were doing the right thing, and it was still very much their fault. They were still very much responsible for their actions. So yeah, it's still very much Gwyn's fault that everything is so insanely fucked up, especially by the end of Dark Souls 3. I mean, think about it. Eons and eons of civilizations rising and falling and doing it all over again with the same outcome just because Gwyn wanted to hold on to something that was far past its expiration date. The Dreg Heap is the absolute end result of Gwyn's actions. So yeah, he probably is the most important figure in the lore of Dark Souls. And yeah, he's very much like Marika in that regard, because Elden Ring wouldn't be the world we know it is without her. And much like the world of Dark Souls, it was definitely something before her, just like the world was something before Gwyn. That's the big reason why I wanted to compare these two characters, because they do have a lot in common. It's just, Well, it appears Marika was active for quite a bit longer than Gwyn, and had a completely different driving purpose, but maybe we'll focus on that in another video. I know I did cover her schemes in one, but I don't think I've ever done like a biography of Queen Marika. I'm sure other channels have, but I don't think I've done that yet. Sounds like it'd be quite the undertaking, but for now I'm working on finishing that serpents video, then one on the creatures of the abyss. It'll probably be a shorter one. I just wanted to highlight how interesting I find them. Plus, it fits the theme of the current series of videos we're doing right now. And then I probably also will get around to doing a little video about the Elden Ring movie, because I do have a lot of thoughts about the cast and how, some of the pictures and videos I've seen from the sets and the filming locations, it all looks very interesting, and I do think the cast is promising, so I probably do have a lot to say on that. And then at some point before this new Witcher 3 DLC comes out, I need to finish up my video on Witcher schools from the games, the books, and maybe I'll briefly mention how they appear in the series. But it's something I've been working on for a while, and with the announcement of that new DLC, it just it sort of reignited my interest in that. Plus, I wanted to do a video on The Witcher 2 for a long time. It's really underrated game. I don't even really like using the term underrated. I just, I never really hear people talk about it, and the game fucking rocks. So yeah, that's probably also on the horizon, but I believe that was everything I wanted to get to in these final thoughts and the previews of what's to come. So as always, everybody stay safe, and you'll be hearing from me very soon. Now let's have our outro, aka the sounds of the alchemical lab.